Every year, millions of people cross borders in search of new cultures, new experiences, and new opportunities for connection. For many countries, especially across Africa, tourism brings vital revenue, creates jobs, and helps place cities on the global map. But alongside the promise of economic growth, there is a more complicated reality beginning to emerge. Around the world, analysts are increasingly raising concerns about the unintended consequences of global travel, particularly when deep economic inequalities shape the relationships between visitors and the communities they visit. In many destinations, travelers arrive from countries with far stronger currencies, meaning their money stretches much further. A meal, a night out, or even a month's rent can cost a fraction of what it might back home. And on the surface, that affordability fuels booming tourism industries. But beneath it lies a dynamic some experts describe as arbitrage tourism, where economic disparity creates significant power imbalances between tourists and local populations. This is a conversation we're getting into right now with our guest, who is on the line and joining us from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. A recent article by Time Africa has spotlighted this particular issue. It's called The Currency of Concern. Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us now Josh Wilson, who is the managing editor of Time Africa. Josh, good morning to you and welcome to Jasiri.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. You guys look great today.
Thank you.
Are we to envy you being in Dubai, or we should feel sorry?
Should we feel sorry? Have you seen?
Are you safe? Have you heard bombs?
Say again?
Have you heard any bombs flying overhead while you're in Dubai?
Yeah, loads.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, I don't envy you again. Okay, Kat, let's go.
So let's start, we like starting actually with a bigger picture, okay? So around the world, tourism has long been linked to economic disparities where travelers from stronger countries or stronger economies visit these countries where their money goes much further. So this is where arbitrage tourism comes in. Now, how does this global pattern evolve? And when does tourism begin to cross the line into exploitation? Josh, can you help us understand this concept of arbitrage tourism? What is it really, and how widespread is it globally?
Yeah, sure. Thank you again. So effectively what you're looking at is a system that is generally from the global north to the global south, where things like currency conversion, regulation, passport power, lesser market in that global south. So a significant financial elevation for the person visiting that has a stronger financial currency, or ultimately a stronger financial position.
Historically, which regions of the world have experienced these kinds of tourism dynamics the most? And what role does currency disparity play in shaping power dynamics between tourists and local communities?
Yeah, it's a good question. So historically, if you look back, and even now, over the course of the past 20 years, specifically places like Southeast Asia, that's historically been a big one. Places like Thailand, in Latin America, places like Colombia, going back to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, the African continent in parts, South Africa, Kenya. So any market effectively that has effectively a lower currency range or lower utilized in this methodology, and how that ultimately works for low predicament where you have the opportunity, you're in that tourism space and you can, or business space, and you can obviously make money from it. That's obviously quite a positive thing. The downside is what you're seeing in certain environments, like in South Africa, for example, where it's driving up house prices in certain areas, which obviously is called gentrification from a terminology standpoint. and pushing out people, into further parts. Same thing is happening in Addis right now, is that they're kind of growing and developing their economy, though that's happening slightly more internally, but they're growing the market this way. And so it's important that local people are given the opportunity to be part of this economic growth and to be a part of that development. If that doesn't happen, you end up with these massive, massive disparities. So that really is a massive key that the public sector enables the local populace to be able to get involved in people injecting money into that environment.
Now, how does poverty or unemployment make communities more vulnerable to these exploitative forms of tourism? Because beyond that, also, is this simply a byproduct of globalization, or are there deeper structural issues that are at play?
Yeah, I mean, well, poverty and unemployment in this, it creates an environment where that exploitation can oftentimes end up in nefarious action, right? So if you're dealing with somebody, or you're dealing in a situation where someone has a lot of power, specifically financially, over an environment, that oftentimes can lead to actions that are just not the best, right? Which has become a problem in these markets. And also, it goes the other way around. There can also be perpetrations of nefarious actions from a local populace to a populace coming into a market as well. So in both ways, it creates this dynamic that isn't ideal, and this can happen ultimately in any market, right? There are people in our major global hubs that are wealthier and more financially secure than others, and there's exploitation there. The differentiation in this, if you get those same people and you then go to a market that is significantly decreased, obviously you're then going to see something much worse and potentially much more nefarious, and hence, which is why the regulation around this is really key, so that a market can grow and develop on the basis of this. Whilst obviously not, sacrificing why people are coming there in the first place, which is the local populace and the local culture and all of these very, very important elements. And ultimately, what you want to be able to do is utilize this as a system to be able to push against unemployment and push against poverty. The problem is that if you're attracting people that have this kind of nefarious kind of thought process in regards to exploiting people or exploiting situations, it can cause obviously dramatic harm to an environment.
It's really interesting because as you're talking about this, I'm remembering Dirty December. We just had our whole, I think from the middle of November into the second week of January, a very festive time here in Nigeria, particularly in Lagos, known as Dirty December. And we've all complained about house rents, transportation, the transportation costs as well. A lot of people tying the astronomical increase at that point in time to the tourism that comes with Dirty December. So it leads me to my next question, which some people will argue that tourism still brings much needed economic opportunity. We had food vendors cashing out, we had clubs, lounges cashing out, restaurants cashing out, Airbnb cashing out, Uber and Bolt and all these e-hailing cab people cashing out as well. So how do we balance that with the concerns about exploitation? Are there warning signs that we should start looking to for when tourism takes a very problematic turn?
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, it's when it starts to become too concentrated, right? If economics starts to become highly concentrated and there is no element of that benefiting the local populace, that's when it starts to become a problem, right? So it's good when you talk about food vendors and people that have local businesses that can hopefully utilize this incoming traffic and then utilize that to then grow an economy. And the SME sector is obviously extremely important in that, right? You want to make sure that you have an SME economy which we have an amazing SME economy, on the continent that a lot of people don't know about, which can be utilized as a methodology to create a stronger economy. As you say, Dirty December, I was in Accra during Delhi December, and similar thing, prices kind of go through the roof, restaurant prices go through the roof, hotel prices go through the roof, because then they want to make sure they're capitalizing on these things, right? And obviously a lot of tourists, some tourists obviously notice this as well, and they feel like they're getting unfairly targeted. I'm a Jamaican national too, and you go to some tourist spots in Jamaica, and there are literally two prices. If you have a Jamaican passport, it's one price, and if you do not have a Jamaican passport, it's another price. So I think that the warning sign is, if your economy starts to get to a stage where people can literally go there and exploit dramatically, that's where it ultimately becomes a problem here. You want to be able to have an economy that's able to accept and bring in wealth and bring in, that positive growth from a tourism perspective to grow an economy, and utilize that in a positive fashion, like what was done here in Dubai, where I live. And you had a lot of Emiratis that owned businesses in free zones, for example, where people would register their companies, for example, that owned restaurants, and the government helped them, create these businesses to make sure that a lot of the tourism that was coming in, and a lot of the people that ergo ended up staying, were able to capitalize on that positively. Similarly, with the real estate market, what you're seeing in Cape Town right now is just growing exponentially. Same thing in a place like Johannesburg, growing exponentially, because people are going there, they love it, they want to stay. And these are the markets that you're able to utilize for growth and development, and that's what you want to be able to see more. The warning signs are, if you do not have a public sector and leadership that helps then grow these other elements of the economy, and to help create the rails to grow these other elements of the economy, as you're bringing in these flashpoints of financial and economic growth, that's when it becomes a problem, because then it doesn't go anywhere. The growth doesn't go anywhere. And it's important that, specifically on the continent, we realize that we need to make sure those rails are in place to create the growth from these incoming financial incentives, so to speak, whilst obviously we're not leaving our populace to be taken advantage of.
Josh, in this age of social media, exploitation is no longer happening quietly in the shadows. It's right in our faces. It's sometimes broadcast for the entire world to see. A disturbing recent case involving a foreign content creator who filmed encounters with women across several African cities using wearable technology, and then posted the video online for profit. We have already had that conversation here on the series some time past, and this is just one of the examples, that raises a new and urgent question. Are we entering the era where exploitation itself becomes entertainment? So I would like to hear, I want to know what you think, especially about this incident that I just referenced, because it brings about global attention and to the new concept, because it's a new one. This concept called content tourism is not just the visuals of women. It could just be visuals of your country and all the hot spots in it. So what are your thoughts on this, Josh?
Yeah, of course, and thank you for asking. Once again, it's a completely despicable act to film somebody like that without their consent, specifically in a manner that is deemed sexual or inappropriate. Once again, in this market, that is, it's completely illegal, and that person would be arrested here. And similarly, we need to make sure that there is regulation in place where there are explicit penalties for such. This is not, we're not a continent to be exploited. Our people are not a continent to be exploited, and we have strong people throughout these jurisdictions. And it's important that, in these cases where people are going from country to country, the cases can be built, on the basis of someone's interactions and someone's someone's actions in numerous places and numerous nations. We cannot allow, these things to happen. So it's regulation is really key in these moments, and that ends up being the precursor to all this. You can't, a lot of people, as I mentioned, Thailand, for example, a lot of people go to Thailand and they partake in some of the kind of sex tourism, as it were, in places like this. And the same thing in a place like Colombia. And, what ends up happening is if you are in a situation where someone is exploited in these markets or something like that, there are heavy penalties, for you. And it's not going to be good. Because they see it as obviously extremely disrespectful as it is. And so we can't allow these things to happen. When we see, our people being disrespected in these ways, to see women be disrespected in these ways, or our populace in general, these aren't things that we can allow, and regulation needs to make sure that we can protect people, and that our governments are protecting people, and we need to take a hardline stance against these things. That's very important. And so anytime that they do come into any African nation, and they have done something like this that is exploitative, or is being filmed without consent, being put across social media without consent, that person must be heavily penalized. And so that's another reason why it's very important that there is more coordination and more synchronicity, at the very least, across the continent. So, these types of offenders, they can't get away with it.
Well, Josh, but what makes this phenomenon different from traditional forms of exploitative tourism? Is it only because technology seems to be playing a big role in, the form of smart glasses, hidden cameras, and social media platforms? How is tech changing the landscape?
Yeah, well, technology is certainly making it easier, oftentimes, to commit some of these things that we're talking about, right? Smart glasses, it's, for me at least, it's very difficult to tell. I'm not really staring at someone, staring if they have cameras and all these different things. But the exhibition of that content is a massive part in this, right? And I think that that's where we need to make sure that we're looking, that anyone that is caught, doing these types of things or filming people, once again, without their consent, they have to be heavily penalized. And we have to make sure that we have systems in place where we are heavily documenting these things, and that we're seeing what the uptakes in technology are, where we can make sure that we are aware, and that we can counter these things. So we just need to make sure that we're aware across all of these fronts, across all of the nations across the continent, so that once again, these exploitative measures can't be put into place. But as you say, it's obviously getting easier for people. Back when we were younger, people used to use camera phones and things like that to get shots, to intrude on people's personal lives, for example, specifically women. And these things happen today. That same mindset still exists, and we need to make sure that we know what these technologies are. We know how they can be utilized, and if they are found to be utilizing technologies such as this, ultimately it's still the action that ends up being penalized in the output. So that if someone is putting this on social media, on platforms, etc., that is immediately penalized, with hopefully criminal measures. And similarly, if we find it on someone's hard drive and someone's data, that should also be criminalized. I think we need to make sure that we're taking a harsh stance on these things. But you're right, technology is certainly making these things easier, and it's also obviously making it harder to catch people. And that's why we need to make sure we have countermeasures in place to stop these things.
All right, okay, Josh, so let's take a look at what's going on in Cape Town, where that report points out that Cape Town's public health clinics see roughly 4,000 STI-related visits every month. Now, take a look at a city like that already has a burden, a significant STI burden. What then happens when you introduce highly mobile visitors who may be engaging in multiple sexual encounters across different locations? What can we project, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. I mean, the highest STI and STD rates in the world are in the United States of America, which we often forget, and it's obviously followed then by South Africa. And we don't want to get into a situation where we're like that, and we have a rampant problem to that degree, of STIs and STDs. And I think that once again, public messaging is important, which they're starting to do a very, very good job at in South Africa for protection and safety. But once again, you're dealing in a system of financial prowess and that can lead to exploitation that happens in a lot of places, right? And it's important that as an individual, you're able to obviously protect and understand these scenarios and the risks yourself. I think that's very, very key ultimately in all this. And also, we need to make sure that there are, as I mentioned, that public messaging is in place the right way, so that something like this doesn't end up being a precursor that can, spiral out of control. As we saw from COVID, these things, they can spread very, very quickly, if not contained. So it's all of our problems, right? Public safety in this regard, sexual health and sexual safety, it's all of our problems. So we need to make sure that we are conducting ourselves safely, as individuals, and that we keep obviously increasing our scientific technology to counter a lot of these things. But certainly through this kind of topic around the currency of consent, it's a worry that if you do have people that are engaging in illicit transactions on the predication of financial prowess, that these things can spiral out of control. Now that's obviously on the basis, it's actually quite interesting. We're basing this on this idea that financial prowess can obviously lead to having more sexual partners, which is quite interesting as a topic in itself. But if it does, we need to make sure that people are prepared and that people have an understanding. This can happen everywhere, so we need to make sure that that messaging is very, very strong, and once again that the environment is being built in the right way, and that our zeitgeist and public consciousness is not one that is highly what's the word? It's highly spread, or people are engaging in multiple sexual encounters. That isn't something that is deeply encouraged.
I don't know why this just happens to a lot of women. Research also shows that high rates of bacterial STIs like chlamydia and gonorrhea among young women in Western Cape. Yes, that one is so prevalent. Why are young women often the most vulnerable in these situations? And beyond that, the report actually raises concern that social media-driven encounters can happen very quickly. And we have seen that play out on social media, sometimes between complete strangers who have just met. Do you think this phenomenon could possibly or potentially reverse all the hard work and progress that we've made in Africa, especially in areas where we're talking about STI and HIV prevention programs in countries like South Africa? And do you think this actually risks damaging the image of African cities internationally? Because they can start to portray us unfairly as places where you can catch, vulnerable disease, or where exploitation is easy.
Josh, can you
Yeah,
think,
no,
just
that's great.
hold on. Joshua, hold on. Just think about, I called you Joshua like I'm your mother. Josh, just hold on. Just think about that question. We'll get your answer. You're laughing. We'll get your answer in just a moment. We need to take a quick break. Stay with us.
Sure.
I'm not. Russian boy.
Yeah, so.
In Thailand, women from the
Thank you so much for staying with us. A conversation about the currency of exploitation when it comes to tourism and, of course, exploitation and vulnerability across the continent. Just before the break, Lolo asked a question about what we see in terms of the young women who are often most vulnerable in the situations. And the report from Time Africa, the currency of consent, there it is, in terms of how this could also risk damaging the image of African cities internationally, showing them to be places where exploitation is easy. Still with us right now is the managing editor of Time Africa, Josh Wilson, as we take a look at this. So Josh, just basically on that, you mentioned Thailand earlier. Many of us understand the context when Thailand comes up in tourism conversations, and that's typically of a sexual nature. Are we running the risk of also seeing some countries across the continent or some cities across the continent also starting to earn that sort of sex tourism reputation, even though unfortunately it already exists in places like the Gambia? We know that's a situation and an ongoing conversation. But do we risk seeing that further happen across the continent, damaging the reputation of cities and countries, and also particularly reversing, let's go back to that, reversing the trends, the gains we've made in things like HIV, AIDS, and STIs, especially in countries like South Africa that have a high burden of such?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. First off, as it pertains to young women, yes, they are, the most vulnerable. It certainly takes two to tango. Once again, you want to make sure that the education is there, and that is prevalent. I think that's a massive part, in all of this. As South Africa, specifically in Southern Africa, we're finding out a lot through TRC in regards to what was done there, and some of the elements the apartheid regime partook in as time goes on. This potentially being a part of it in regards to disease manufacturing and distribution, and obviously it's left them in quite a tough spot, which they seem to be combating very well. But as you say, certainly in the Western Cape, you're seeing obviously these rising rates, and we want to make sure from an image perspective that doesn't consolidate in any way, right? I have a lot of friends in Dubai that are from Latin America, and it blows their mind every time they mention that they're from Colombia. Narcotics is mentioned, and when people mention Thailand, there were sometimes some kind of jokes made about that as well. And I think it's very, very key that we are able to control and shape that narrative in a positive way. And I think by and large, we do obviously on the continent. I think that any time that you have financial prowess over a jurisdiction, these things can happen. I think they happen probably. We're less known for these things actually on the continent, as it stands, and obviously we want to make sure that we keep it that way. But that's the fear in all these things, is if these markets become significantly attractive, and South Africa is certainly heading that way, that these places can get known for such. But historically, we're not known for that. We're not known for that as a specific segmentation of our society, once again, from a zeitgeist standpoint. And as you say, we want to make sure that we keep it that way, and that we're celebrating the amazing innovation that happens on the continent each and every single day, that's solving real world problems, and the amazing stories and narratives we have both historically and in the present, and the amazing once again gains that we've made across many jurisdictions across the continent as well, that people sometimes forget or do not know about. Nigeria sometimes being a really key example of that, in terms of the specific gains that have been made by certain governors. And we honored the governor of Lagos recently for some of the gains that he'd made in that state. And these are the things that we want to be known for as we grow and develop. And it's very important that we are able to control that zeitgeist in a positive way. The way that we act has to honor, our families and the people around us and our friends. And I think that we've always had cultures across the continent that are very, very good at those things, right? And the empowerment of people across the continent is going to be very, very key in that. Because if it doesn't impress you that someone has, a lot of money, then it doesn't really mean much, right? So it's important that people are empowered financially, that we build the right rails in order for people to be empowered. And then these things, they become much, much less of an issue. But that comes from having a strong public sector to be able to create these rails where this exploitation cannot happen, as I mentioned prior, cannot spiral out of control.
Speaking of innovation, as more travelers document their experiences online, do you think digital accountability will become an important part of tourism regulation in the future? Could this moment actually become an opportunity for Africa to redefine tourism on its own terms, rather than simply replicating models seen in other parts of the world? And what could, if yes, what could our ethical tourism frameworks, that's the guidelines that shape how visitors interact with local communities, look like?
We are literally out of time, Joshua.
Yeah, I'm really happy you asked.
I said we're literally out of time, so I'll need it in just under a minute.
Sure, no worries at all. Once again, I think that we need to make sure that we have the correct systems in place, so that tourists coming in, they have a healthy, and I want to say that very clear, healthy amount of fear about misbehaving in your environment. That when I first moved to Dubai 5 years ago, one of the first things someone said was, don't mess around out there, because there is a healthy fear that if you do things that are nefarious or wrong in some way or harm the public zeitgeist, that there will be repercussions. And we need to make sure that that regulation exists throughout the continent, and that we ourselves also adhere to those rules. That's going to be very, very key in all this. And the digital element of that digital transformation element, that's going to be a prime part of this, as you say, so that these exploitative means and measures, that they cannot seek root.
Thank you so much, Josh Wilson, Managing Editor of Time Africa. Thank you so much for joining us. I have a feeling we'll be seeing you again soon.